The Vincast, Australia's premier podcast about wine, wine culture and wine people, is proudly supported by Different Drop. Different Drop is an online wine retailer based up in Sydney that's a little bit different to your average wine shop. They pride themselves on sourcing very small producers who are working in a very innovative or unique way and putting them together in a way that is exciting for the consumer. So you can go to the website differentdrop.com. You can put your own kind of mixed pack together, or there are already some mixed packs ready to be ordered, and they can ship them to you anywhere around Australia in only a few days. You can help support the podcast by going to differentdrop.com, and when you make your first purchase over $100, if you put in the voucher code VINCASTVINO, the guys from Different Drop will actually give you $25 off. And you can actually find a lot of the guests that I've had on the podcast. You can find their wines on that website. So if you enjoyed the episode, why not buy some of the wine and help support the producer as well, and help thank my guests for their generous time. Different Drop is changing the way people buy wine. On this episode 54 of the Vincast, I chat with Tom Belford, one half of Bobar Wines, based in the Yarra Valley. We talk a little bit about his background and how they're reimagining the way people make wine in the Yarra Valley. I've also got a special question for you at the end of the episode, so stay tuned. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Guestbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and thank you very much for tuning in. Really exciting guest I've got for this episode. I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone thinks. I'm sure people will be somewhat familiar with the wines because they've got a bit of a cult following here in Australia, but really interesting chat, and I hope you enjoy it. Of course, it's great to hear from people, whether it's on social media or even in real life. And I'm really excited because I've got really lots of people coming up to me and saying how much they enjoy the podcast and wanting to be on the show itself. So exciting times ahead, and obviously I really appreciate everyone listening and enjoying the show and letting me know about it. Now, I don't actually have an Ask the Wino question this week. Again, guys, if there's something that you'd like answered on the show, or for me to chat about, even if you want me to chat about it with a guest, let me know. Just use the hashtag AskTheWino on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, wherever, because I'd love to hear from you. Also, people, you didn't tell me who your favourite WA producer is. Again, I'll ask the question at the end of the episode, so stay tuned for that. And I'd love to hear your answers, and you can actually hear your responses read out on the podcast. So as I mentioned, exciting guest for this week, Tom Belford. He is one half of Bobar Wines with his wife Sally, and they are probably making one of the most exciting Syrah wines in Australia at the moment. Very, very different to your average Australian Syrah. So I'd love to chat with him, and I hope you enjoy it. I'll see you on the other side. Tom, welcome to, the new, Vincast studio. Thanks for making the trek in from the Yarra Valley today, and welcome to the Vincast.
My pleasure.
So tell me, I typically, as listeners would know, I ask what was the first interaction with wine for you that sort of set you on the path of a passion and career, that kind of thing?
I grew up in Yarra Valley, in Yarra Glen. In fact, in the same house I now live in. And
the house that I visited with my friend Jacopo and Laura.
Yeah.
Back in January.
Yep, that house. And I worked as a teenager in vineyards, just doing the summer work usually over those long summer holidays, 6 weeks. Mm-hmm. And it was lots of vineyards being planted at the time, and I got work banging nails into posts and running an irrigation line and swimming in dams and, getting sunburnt.
Were you passionate about it though?
No. Look, it was work, and I really enjoyed it because it was with lots of other young folk, and we had a ball out there in the vineyards. Money in the pocket, yeah. And then I finished high school, and I got into university course and wasn't necessarily, it was a science course, and yeah, it was along the lines of what I was interested in, but I wasn't absolutely dead certain. And
did you have a bit of a science focus back at school?
Yeah. That was my kind of, but it was probably a bit more sort of natural sciences. I didn't necessarily do. I love pure sciences from an interesting point of view.
Sure.
But I couldn't say myself. I was definitely not going to pursue a career as a chemist or a physicist or something. It just wasn't my interest.
Yeah.
I'd read a book about it, but I wouldn't do it. And I got full-time work I deferred my university course and ultimately ended up with more work in vineyards, and that was kind of just drifting along. And
wool work?
Sorry, no, more work in...
More work, sorry.
More work, yeah. Wool work. Yeah, sorting wool, jackarooing. No, I was more work in vineyards, and the summer sort of started to turn to autumn, and I ultimately ended up working at Yarra Ridge Winery for vintage. I was working in the vineyard at Yarra Ridge, and I was simply told to start in the winery like on Monday morning, just next Monday morning, start in the winery.
Yeah.
And I was actually going to be working vintage. They just wanted an extra couple of hands for vintage.
Sure.
And look, I had so much fun. All my friends were off at university and drinking $2 pots. And I was suddenly working with folk from all around the world, driving forklifts, working in the middle of the night, drinking beer as well. And it was I just had the most fabulous time, and I was thrust into the adult world and this fun world, and yeah, there was a bit of science there, but it was just heaps and heaps of hard work and fun more than anything. And I was working long vintage hours, and I'd never seen money like it. And then I guess I kind of fell in love with the work of it. I just sort of thought this is a lot of fun. I was having a lot of fun, and that was 1997, and about exactly at that point in time, Yarra Valley had come off the 96 vintage.
Yeah.
The 1996 vintage, which was a cold vintage and made some outstanding Chardonnays and Pinot Noirs.
Well, I certainly know, when I was working at Domaine Chandon, 96 was considered a great year for sparkling base.
Yeah, and it was a disastrous year for I'm sure there was good Cabernets made, but it was certainly...
On the valley floor, I would think.
Yeah. And I guess, you name the likely suspects and they probably make good wines. But what I really...
Slightly more elegant expressions, I would think.
Yeah. And there would have been some herbaceous and even rotten... from the stories were that it was a bit rotten vintage as well.
Yeah.
And... but I just remember there was a wine or two that I remember that just really caught my imagination, that I sort of suddenly saw... As well as hanging out with wine folk, hanging out with winemakers and listening to them talk about it. And then I was able to taste these wines, and the work I'd done over in all the summers preceding in the vineyards. And I kind of got that little glimmer of these wines that come from this place and particularly with one wine, 96 Yarra Ridge Reserve Pinot. And it just sparked a thing in me. And I think at that point I was fascinated and I was going to be working in wine, and then that was it. So then from that one on, I've never not worked in vineyards or wineries.
So you grew up essentially in a wine region, and I guess one of the better known wine regions in Australia, in the Yarra Valley. What did your parents do?
They'd come to the Yarra Valley with thoroughbred horse breeding.
Okay,
that's what my dad was.
Sure.
And I think it happens. They had a family, and
so it was sort of an agricultural.
Yeah, and they certainly they liked wine. It was respected, but it wasn't. We weren't a wine loving household, and there was always a bag in box in the fridge, and
there wasn't that kind of having wine with food. It's like, we have to pick the right wine. It's just sort of like
no.
There.
The wine was there. Yeah, wine was there. Yeah, and yeah, exactly right. And I kind of. And they come to an area. Look, viticulture wasn't a big thing in the 70s when they came to the Yarra Valley, and I guess that they kind of just settled in the Yarra Valley as their kids started to grow up and ended up in high school. And that's like what happens. People put down roots, and they put down roots in the Yarra Valley. And I was there, and I guess the timing was that I was as I became like a teenager, the vineyards really started to rock.
Yeah, did you sort of feel that like as in your early teens and then late teens and in the 90s, as the Yarra Valley got further developed, as big players like, for example, Domaine Chandon, de Bordelais, and then the bigger wine companies started to establish businesses in the Yarra Valley, or at least vineyards to blend with other stuff. Was there a kind of a feeling that, wine is becoming a much more serious thing in the Yarra Valley? It's much bigger. There's lots of jobs going around. Is that kind of... was it because of that, like in terms of, establishing vineyards, that initial work as a teenager, because of that big development?
Yeah, without question. I mean, I was amongst I was working with people I'd been to primary school with, and it was a big group of us. It was this kind of, and it was a sense of a boom. There really was. We were all banging off to university.
And it was a similar situation with them. None of them really necessarily came from wine families.
No, not at all. Absolutely, we would have gone on to become, who knows what. Probably many of us would have. I would have left town. I would have gone somewhere else, and I would have moved to Melbourne and done something different.
Well, yeah, because Yarra Valley is quite interesting. It's less than an hour, certainly now, from Melbourne. It's country, but it's not country, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
There isn't that kind of isolation. It's not difficult to get down to Lilydale and then jump on a train all the way into the city, for example, even as a teenager.
Yeah, I was essentially grew up in the suburbs. Really.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a pretend country.
But which I guess I would think that being further away from a big city like Melbourne, being well out into the country, opportunities are somewhat limited, and so definitely an agricultural kind of pursuit is much more expected. Whereas, you through, I guess, almost accidentally in terms of that work and then getting the gig at Yarra Ridge led you on that path. Whereas you could have, as you said, kind of become a scientist in some way. Yeah,
or something completely different. Exactly. You just kind of head off down a different avenue. And it was there was no actual particular sense of me having I think my parents would have, my dad always had a thing for like going, he kind of, I think in hindsight, actively encouraged me gently to get work in the vineyards. I think he could see it as a good thing. It was an interesting thing to do. It was fascinating, actually. It was probably endlessly interesting, and it was it certainly had a sense of this is going to be something. This is not ostriches.
And so, what was your first vintage experience like? Did you enjoy the obviously longer hours, and as you said, working at nights? Was that kind of quite an eye-opening experience about the realities of working in a winery?
Absolutely. I'd come of age. I was working with it was a crew from Chile. There was a guy we called Chile because he was from Chile, and there was a guy from the UK, and I don't know. I just remember it just being it was eye-opening. It was the real world. I've gone from high school to, and then
and with some of these guys, had they worked vintages in a lot of other places as well, or they weren't sort of rookies like you?
No. I remember this guy from the UK, and he worked for a big. I can't remember who it was now, but like a big stately UK wine in the wine trade.
Oh, okay, like
importing Bordeaux and
Majestic or something.
Yeah. It was sort of ancient sounding companies.
And who had an office in Bordeaux, for example.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. And they'd been around since the 18th century or something. And it just sort of I mean, he seemed to know everything about wine in the entire world to me.
Sure.
I remember him dipping a hand into a tank and having a sip from his hand, because we were sort of trying to work out what tank, which one, what are we doing here? Is this the right tank? And I remember him saying, well, it's a Cabernet of some sort. And I was just amazed that you could dip your hand into a tank and know that it was Cabernet.
So obviously, as any winemaker or anyone in the industry knows, wineries exist off beer. But what were some of the wines you started to taste apart from Yarra Ridge or Yarra Valley stuff that started to open your eyes a little bit more early on?
I kind of got right into. I really quickly got into. Started drinking pretty widely, but pretty commercially. Like, you don't really know. I didn't know much about anything, and I'm glad.
Sort of what's successful, I guess.
Yeah, and in hindsight, I'm really glad that I did it. Like, I remember going to Liquorland and selecting stuff off the shelf. Like, it was the most fascinating thing on earth. And
I started in Liquorland, and so I had a similar kind of. You get to know the big name stuff. You go, okay, cool. You work out the varieties and you work out the regions, and then you start, noticing eventually, site specific and producer nuances and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's a long kind of a path, really. But Clare Riesling, I remember being a thing. I remember loving Clare Riesling.
Yeah.
And Hunter Valley Semillon.
Okay.
And that was sort of, I guess, they're early wines that kind of caught my imagination, particularly Hunter Semillon. And I remember we used to get wine allowance off Muldara. We were owned by Yarra Ridge was owned by Muldara Blass. And
Sure.
we used to every month we could get a case of wine. And it was an enormous portfolio of, and I think they owned Rothbury Estate.
Oh wow.
And so we were getting Rothbury Estate Semillons.
That's lots of wine to get. Did you have any kind of mentors early on who sort of would slip you a bottle and say, "Oh, try this, Tom. Try this. What do you think of this?" kind of thing?
I can't remember anyone specific, to be honest.
It was just sort of a
I remember really looking up to people. I was essentially vineyard based as well. I worked in vineyards. I worked in the winery and vintage usually, but I worked in vineyards, and that was what my work was. And up until 10 years ago, that's all I did.
Sure.
I generally worked vintage because I loved it in the winery, in the cellar. But I was vineyard based, so essentially farming based. That was my kind of. In many ways, when I talk about sort of pursuing science or something, I did really want to become a farmer. And grape farming was a thing to do.
Yeah.
So out in the vineyard, look, wine isn't such a big thing. So,
yeah. Well, in fact, my guest a few weeks ago, Tess Brown, she had a similar experience as a viticulturalist, as a vineyard. She said, "Yeah, we didn't really drink as much. It's not like all the winemaking students, at Charles Sturt getting together and it's like opening a whole bunch of bottles. We tended not to do that as much. So
no, and it's not something you've spoken about as much. But I was with people, Marcus Satchell and Rob Hall. I went through university with and worked with Paul Bridgman, and they were people kind of I looked to as they seemed to know an enormous amount because they were working cellar hands and junior winemakers at the same place I was, and so I remember sort of feeding off them a little bit, but something that I probably pursued on my own a little bit. I don't remember a specific mentor at that early stage.
Right.
Actually, no, I do. Ian McLean at Yarra Vineyards. I used to work on the weekends.
Oh, wow.
Up at Yarra, in the vineyard, like pulling out canes and burning piles of canes. That's what I really remember. That's where I was when Princess died, actually.
Oh, wow.
But he sort of fed me Yarra Valley Cabernet.
So you mentioned studies. When did the study start?
1998, I started a viticulture degree.
Okay.
At Charles Sturt.
Yeah. Okay. So were you doing that by correspondence?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you find that challenging?
Yes, no. I mean, I guess I was quite young. I had plenty of time. In the early part of that degree, no. Like, it would seem to be. I studied quite a lot, and it was. It was a lark, and it was always information, and you're young and you're a sponge, and you just kind of love it, and it all seems so important.
Yeah.
But at Charles Sturt, I met Sally, who's my wife, and who I do Bobar, who's the other half of Bobar. And by the time we finished that degree, we were married and had one kid and one on the way. So the last half of that...
How long did the degree take?
It took 7 years.
Right,
so
okay.
Took 7
I was going to say, it's like, what were you, like 22?
Yeah, I was relatively young. But but the study got a lot harder as the years went on. It's just that tyranny of distance and time. Life gets busier. And
yeah, in fact, Evo... He said he had similar experience. It took him years to finish his degree.
We managed to only lose a year in the end. So. that last semester or two, holy moly, staying up to this crazy, smashing out assignments in 2 days.
Yeah. Oh, that's the story of my entire career. Always leave it at the last minute. So where was Sally also from the Yarra Valley? Or where did you meet Sally?
She grew up in Brisbane.
Okay.
And I somehow she started to head south from Brisbane and went to, was it New England in northern New South Wales?
Uh-huh.
A cool part of New South Wales, a little bit inland, sort of inland from Byron Bay. And
cool as in groovy or cool as in climate?
Cool as in cold.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think it was quite isolated, pretty uncool actually, I think. And I don't know, somehow along the way she just got obsessed with the idea of cool climate viticulture, and it enrolled in the course, I think. I don't quite know the sequence of events, actually. And then ultimately ended up not in Yass, so not far from Canberra, and working in Hilltops area, and she might have done some work in Murray Bateman. I think that might have been a friend. I can't remember the exact. And she ended up working in a vineyard in Jugigong, so sort of, I don't know what region it would be, Hilltops or sort of closest to Gundagai.
But was she studying externally as well, and you just met like residential school type stuff?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
We all res schools.
Yeah.
And,
so was it a long distance relationship initially?
Sort of. No, not entirely. It took a few years to absolutely crystallise. But she was progressively moved further south, and she was in Heathcote, and ultimately moved to the Yarra Valley.
Right.
And it was probably when she was living in Yarra Valley, I think, when it all went click.
It became official.
Yeah.
And how
stepped outside of red schools. So.
how long did you end up staying at Yarra Ridge?
I worked there and left there in 2000.
Right. Okay.
And so I did sort of approximately 4 years there, full time vineyard work. Mm-hmm. Worked a few vintages, and then did a bit of flapping around, a bit of vineyard work around the valley, and for another year or two, and then headed off to Macedon Ranges. We we went to Lancefield.
Yeah.
I worked at Curly Flat Vineyard.
Yeah.
So I worked at another little vineyard in Lancefield. Mm-hmm. And we spent a couple of years in Lancefield.
Certainly chasing the cool climate there.
Yeah, it was cold. And it was really windy too. So.
But again, not far from Melbourne.
No.
In fact, even closer than Yarra Valley.
Yeah, it's pretty quick. It's pretty quick. It's an easier drive because there's no houses. Mm-hmm. It's just you should get onto the Calder and fly down, and it's not like with not that urban sprawl out the east as out towards the Yarra Valley. There's houses essentially all the way, suburbs all the way. But
so you and Sally both sort of have more of that viticultural focused early on. How did you kind of get more experience as far as the winemaking, just working vintage at different places? Did you go and work overseas at all?
Hadn't at that stage. No, we moved back to after the Lancefield experience. We'll head back home just before the winter, just before we go through another one of these.
Well, your home at least.
Yeah. We head back to the Yarra, exactly right, back to my home, and we'll get out of this place before it gets super cold again. And came back to the Yarra Valley, and I sort of at that point went, okay, I really want to make wine. This viticulture has been, I guess, in many ways directed entirely towards wine has always been the focus, but because of that delineation in Australia between vineyards and wineries, I'm not working in vineyards. I'm simply not going to get the skills and learn the stuff and hang out with the people that I really want to in order to learn what I really want to, which is how to craft wine. Yeah. And we moved back to the Yarra Valley, and I spent looking for a job, any job really, as a cellar hand. And I figured, well, I don't think there was any real theory to it. Take the first job you come across, and ended up at the Borderleys. The Borderleys had a cellar hand position going, and I didn't realise how good it was going to be, and started working there, and actually, I guess, chanced it for a really exciting group of people and a really exciting time. And I've spent 3 years at the Borderleys as a cellar hand.
Well, certainly, there's some pretty amazing names who were at the Borderley back in those days. Obviously, former guest Bill Downey. And I can imagine, particularly in terms of access to different sites in the Yarra Valley, it must have been pretty fantastic to sort of be playing around in the cellars with, different parcels of Pinot and Chardonnay.
Yeah, and seeing how they went about it and the general philosophy. I think they were throwing a lot of things around at the time. Like they were really turning up. They were trying out a lot of different, almost simpler ways to make wine. And I just learned enormous.
Do you mean, like, when you say simpler, do you mean like a less is more approach?
Less is more, yeah. Okay. Look, they were working hard in the vineyards as well, working on these. They had some really beautiful vineyards. Yeah. At the Dixon's Creek property's got some beautiful blocks. Yeah. And they'd always made great wines off them. There was stuff coming out of the Upper Yarra. They started doing the gear with Phi. Yeah. And there was just some people. Bill Downey was doing his thing, and Paul Bridgman was doing his Shiraz project, and I just sort of chanced. I just got lucky for a time when there was a lot of people. They were learning hard and fast and drinking great wine, and
but we're talking about the real boom, particularly as cooler climate wines really started to come into favour a lot more, and in terms of premium, and people were happy to pay for good quality wine, and so the opportunities were there. There was a real dream period, I guess, to sort of be learning all about wine and learning about the Yarra Valley as well.
Yeah. I probably didn't realise at the time in many respects. I mean, I was just dragging hose around and pumping wine from one tank to another. Mm-hmm. So you sort of, in many respects, not an outsider, but you're an observer to it. Mm. You, as a cellar hand, I was an observer, and you just kind of let it wash over you a little bit. Or let it soak in. So I was just lucky to be around I learned some good skills and some good ways of thinking about it. And
what was Sally doing at that time?
She was doing a bit of work at Yarra, mm-hmm. and we were having babies. Mm.
Somewhat occupied.
Yeah, and
she had a more important job.
So by that stage we had two children.
Sure.
And we weren't doing any wine of our own.
Right.
And
had you started talking about eventually kind of going down that path, and did you kind of like the idea of becoming a vigneron?
Oh, that was without question. I think that was always that's where it was always going. Mm-hmm. It wasn't something that we would. I don't really remember speaking specifically about it, and there was no time frame put on it. But right. That was what we were going to do. Mm-hmm. I've never wanted to get boots in too early. Sort of, I've always been like, I'm not in any great screaming hurry. I really felt like we didn't understand the cellar craft.
Sure.
At that stage.
Sure.
And which is what we were doing, was learning cellar craft. Mm-hmm. And by just simply immersing yourself in wine. Sally also worked at the Borderleys during the vintage period.
Sure.
Just doing the same stuff.
Driving that was fun.
Yeah. Driving forklift around and rolling barrels around.
Yeah.
And and it was at the end of the board, and then we split and went overseas. And
so where did you go overseas?
We went to France for 15 months. We threw it in and took the kids. And
where did you end up?
We went to there was no real firm plan apart from stay for 2 vintages. Uh-huh. That was the kind of plan, and which everyone said you couldn't do it, so we kind of went, to hell with that, we'll do
it. You can't tell us what to do.
We couldn't get any visas, so we flew. And and we spent the first 3 months in Champagne, and we did a bit of a cook's tour, really. And we the kids were in school, and so we tended to work a school semester. And I had a working holiday visa, so I could work for 3 months with a single employer. So we tended to do, and a school semester was 3 months, so we tended to do 3 months in a region.
Wow. And
then we kind of picked the next region based on, I don't know, really. I can't remember. They had to have grapevines there, and and it couldn't be too expensive to live there.
Yeah.
So we ended up in Beaujolais. I think we always wanted to go to Beaujolais. Sally had always had a thing for Beaujolais. And
really?
So we went, that was from the very beginning, one of the first conversations I remember having with her.
Far out, because even when I did eventually get introduced to the concept of Beaujolais, it was sort of like, oh yeah, Beaujolais Nouveau and pretty cheap and basic sort of wines, and then, well, firstly I started to taste some of the wines, but then I actually went there and went, oh my god, this is totally not what I expected.
No, it's
Georges Duboeuf kind of pulled the wool over my eyes a little bit.
Totally, absolutely. I mean, half the area is Beaujolais, and then about a quarter is Beaujolais Village, and some of those wines are exceptional. Mm. And then after that, there's another 10 appellations of Cru Beaujolais, which are all got distinct personalities. And so we went to Villers-Morgon in Morgon, and we spent a month there in the middle of winter, at Christmas time, and then we spent some time in Provence, Cahors, further in the southwest of France as well, a month in Sauterne, and then back to Beaujolais.
Did you speak French?
Not particularly well.
Was it an issue?
Yeah, we know. It was socially isolated in many respects. It was an issue. I could get work. I got quite good at a work spiel. So I'm looking for work spiel. So I might have deceived a few people.
Sure.
When they employed me, I was like, his French is much worse than what we thought.
I actually had that experience in 2012 when I was, looking for work in Germany.
Yeah.
Said, I can learn, it's fine. And then I got into the cellars, and I didn't really need to speak that much German anyway. You know, there were young guys working in the cellars who all had a reasonable amount of English from school. You know, whereas the people who are sort of, I guess, my parents' age or a little bit younger than that, they didn't speak much English, but it wasn't really an issue.
Yeah, well, I found it was a huge issue, language. It was a massive issue. We were out in the country all the time, and not as many people spoke English, I found, as what I expected.
No.
And especially working, I did a lot of vineyard work, and out in the vines, very few people.
If you go into the touristy areas...
Oh, yeah, you can. It's all cool.
Like you go to Beaune.
Cool.
Or you go to Saint-Emilion.
Everyone speaks. In fact, it can
like
be
a
kind
lot
of...
of people who work in the service industry have enough English that they can get by.
Absolutely. I found out that first job in Champagne, that was hard 3 months. That was very hard.
Yeah.
My English was... My French was terrible.
Yeah.
And
out in the vineyards, no one speaks English.
No, it was tough. It was really tough. And
it reminds me, I need to work on my Italian for Sardinia in October.
Yeah, do it. I was in Paris a few weeks ago and when I came home, I was pretty like gotta get a second language properly sorted out.
Japanese doesn't really help me as much in terms of visiting wineries.
No, absolutely not, especially in Sardinia. Yeah.
And eventually you came back to Australia.
Came back
to the Yarra Valley.
Back to the Yarra Valley, back home, and chanced upon a winemaking job at Sticks. I mean, I needed a job. We're coming back. We had no coin, no car.
When was that?
That was in 2008.
Okay.
Very end of 2008.
And you've only just sort of ended the time at Sticks, so that was a fair amount of time you spent there. Almost
7 years. Yeah, 7 years. 7 years I spent doing that job. So I was very inexperienced in some respects. I'd never been exposed. I'd never been a winemaker.
Because that was sort of when Sticks was started, wasn't it? Wasn't Yarra Ridge became Sticks, or was it?
2005 they took over that Yarra Ridge. Yeah, that
because it was sort of just before I started working in the Yarra Valley, which is in 2006.
Yeah, and previously the wines had been made at Punt Road.
Ah, right.
So and I think they were part of. I don't understand it entirely, but they were part of Punt Road, and then in 2005, the Yarra Ridge Winery was bought, and Yarra Ridge Winery and vineyards were bought, and by, I suppose they must have separated around about that point as well. And so I arrived when they were very much settled up that site. So I was actually back at the first winery I started at.
There you go.
Same people too. It was odd.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And when you came back and started back at Yarra Ridge, what was the role that you sort of stepped into?
I started as a cellar hand on my first day, and on that first morning, the assistant winemaker resigned, and so by my morning tea, I'd been promoted to winemaker. So I got home from work. So, how was your first day of work?
I got promoted.
It was good. It went well. Things are falling together.
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess in that still sort of early period of Sticks moving into Yarra Ridge, did they change much? And was it still fairly similar to how things were when it was Yarra Ridge?
Oh, no, it was enormously different, really. I mean, it was for a start, it wasn't. I mean, Yarra Ridge was ultimately ended up as part of a big company, so it was a big corporate structure.
Sure.
And I guess about that time I left in 2000, it was part of, you get the sense it was part of a big company. No, Sticks was independent, and it was actually a lot of fun. I mean, we did a lot of good stuff there, and I guess the winemaking changed enormously in that time I was there, and it was good. Same crew. I had the same sense about it. I had a sense that it was an independent winery, though. And we were grapes came in, wine went out. We were responsible for ourselves, and.
I remember stocking the Sticks once when I was working at King Godfrey, and I thought, these are great. These are good for the price. Jeez.
Yeah, that was always the bang for your buck. The over-deliver. The over-deliver concept.
I think everyone should try and aim to do that. But so at what point did you and Sally actually move towards what became Bobar?
Almost immediately, but we got back in late November 2008 and stepped into a really, really hot summer. I guess in some respect we might have made wine straight away, but we probably, from memory, we had a few things. We came back with nothing. So we essentially waited 1 year, and in 2009 we had bushfires, and so I'm glad we weren't any which way. We were, property was damaged. We damaged not badly, but it was a pretty heavy scene, and I was doing my first vintage as a winemaker in any capacity. I was now working as a winemaker for the first time, and then 2010 was our first. We went out looking for a vineyard that following winter in 2009, and we just had a concept of making a light-bodied wine, red wine, and so I remember Sally talking about carbonic maceration when I first
again Beaujolais,
very very first met her, and we just spent all that time in Beaujolais and drinking beautiful Cru Beaujolais, and we were
lovely and crunchy.
Yeah, and we went, look, what do you have to work with around here? Well, Gamay, but there's not many. There isn't much Gamay, and you're going to be picking something because of a variety, and that's the wrong reason. What we need to do is find a good vineyard and an appropriate variety. So, and you got to work with what you've got. And Merlot, Cabernet, Pinot Noir, I think Shiraz. We decided upon Shiraz that was going to deliver us that crunchy, and we could make it a very versatile variety, and you could go and you could get it too. You could pick it based on a vineyard, and not. It could simply matter of finding the right vineyard.
So it was buying fruit.
Yeah.
And at what point did you start to plant vineyards?
We planted a vineyard, so we're still making the Bobar Syrah still comes from that same vineyard.
Yep.
In Churnside Park.
Yep.
Where we initially bought fruit and still buy fruit.
Yep.
And we planted a vineyard in 2004, I think it was, at home. While I was working at the Borderlies, 2005, 2004, something like that. And it's Cabernet Sauvignon. And it's good. You saw the vineyard. It's a fairly big northeast slope, sitting out there looking at the sunshine, and we chose. Look, I like those sort of classical Yarra Valley Cabernet styles. I decided upon Cabernet when I was about 18 years of age. Before I had any baggage, not not weighed down by lots of opinion and other people's opinions and everything. So to keep things simple,
nice purity.
Yeah, keep the decision pure. And we decided, if I chose Cabernet when I was 18, we'll stick with Cabernet now. And we put in Cabernet, and it was not that vineyard's not being a great advertisement for 2 viticulture degrees. And we got hit with, it was the first spring after we planted it, we got 2 frosts, and it was in the hellish drought.
7 would have knocked it around as well.
7, yeah. So it was the first that we must have planted it.
That was a really bad frost.
Yeah, the spring of 07. And so we must have planted it in the spring of 06. And then so when they were just sort of bud bursting for their first year there, after the and they got smashed by really hardcore frost. And it was super dry all those years. And then by the time the bushfire went through in 09, we had about half the vines left, or even less. And so things were looking a bit scrappy. And then 15 months of neglect while we were in France. And so it was really only probably 3 years ago that we really went, right, let's get serious here. And we filled in all the gaps. And
So in terms of the Syrah still purchased, you started to work with some Chardonnay as well?
Yep. So in 11 we started making Chardonnay. Initially it was off that same vineyard, but then we found just a bit of wasn't really the sort of site we wanted. The vineyard didn't have the feel that we were after, and for Chardonnay. And we ended up at a vineyard directly opposite Yarra Ridge vineyards. Steve Sadlier's vineyard.
Again, you keep returning to it.
Keep going back. And Steve was my first boss in a vineyard. And so Steve, the vineyard owner, Steve Sadlier, he's the farmer. And it's a lovely east-facing site. He's a great farmer. It's a vineyard. It had the perfect feel. It's one of those moments where you walk into something and you go, yep, this is it. This is the one. And so that's where the Chardonnay comes from. So it's in Yarra Glen at the base of the Christmas Hills, facing east.
And you have quite a distinctly less is more approach in terms of the cellar, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I think most people would agree. Where did you did the two of you sort of stumble upon that approach, and to not interfere, or to interfere as little as possible?
I think stumble's kind of, in some ways, the right word. It was almost like stumbled the whole path. It always seemed right, even from, again, going back to a really early conversation I had with Sally, like back at university in bloody late 90s sometime. And kind of being, especially when you're talking to the winemaking students, so we were doing viticulture, but we were sort of hanging out with winemaking students and kind of being a little bit incredulous about particularly like adding of tannins. I remember there was a conversation about the tannins, and there's simply sort of being told that you had to add it. You know, it was like, why? I don't understand.
It's not really a discussion that gets talked about very much.
Does by winemakers. It's very boring. And
but everyone talks about like, you know, oak chips and you know, and added acidity and sulfur and stuff like that.
Lots of stuff that gets added, and it's just because
tannins is not really something that gets talked about.
No, people often don't really think about it. How profound the changes are, and also how it is really driven to just ironing out, I guess, removing nuance. And in some ways, it was more the way we ended up making our wine has been an extension of, I guess, a general philosophy or general ideology of how we live our life.
Yeah.
And we grew garlic sort of micro commercially when I was working at the Borderlies in those years. And that was done the same way. It was, we'd planted garlic, we dug the dirt, made some beds and put some manure on, fertilizer, and planted some garlic and grew some garlic, and then you dig it up by hand and you clean it by hand and you sell it at a market. And it's just a kind of a simplicity. It makes sense, you know. And I guess at around about the last years I worked at the Borderlies, the kind of, it's when we first became aware of, particularly in Beaujolais, we became aware of the Fabulous Four or whatever they call them, the, you know, Marcel Lapierre and John Foyard, etc. in Morgon. Mm-hmm. And that was when it first, and I remember actually
the ones that Alice Firing's obsessed with.
Yeah. And I remember being told about them and then reading about them that night on the internet and going, God, yeah, it's got a name. Someone's done it. I didn't realise. It's this kind of general principle of, surely, I mean, everyone talks about it. Everyone talks about vineyards, about, you just got to grow the grapes and then it all makes itself. And then it's like, well, I don't know, I'm working in a winery and it doesn't look like that to me. It looks like no one's trusting that to me. Like, so often everyone craps on about the vineyards and how you just...
That's something that I've always had an issue with, is everyone's talking about, oh, what an amazing site. It's like, well, I don't really see it that much, because it must be a scary proposition for a lot of people to sort of, in their mind, it's like losing control. So to step away and sort of allow it to express itself and not kind of get in the way of that, using different techniques, must be such a scary proposition.
Yeah, and
particularly if it's a commercial operation, you know, a larger sort of winery where, you know, you've got people to report to. It's sort of like, well, that's just what we have to do.
I think it's that kind of reporting to thing. People set parameters, and you got to. I guess there is a thing where people don't even set parameters. They set parameters in their own mind, and they feel like stepping outside of that's just going to be freaky. But often not really thinking about what adding the acid, like why you're doing it, and I guess nutting it out a little bit, and going, well, if you weren't to do that, or why are you doing it? Why are you doing it? And so just think about what is acidity and why are we worried about it, and what would you do? What's a different way of managing it? What's a different way of going about getting there? I mean, often some of this stuff doesn't come for free, but winemaking craft, tannins are there. They're in the skins, they're in the stalks, and you've got to think about the ones you want and sort of leaves. So many crazy...
Capturing what nature is providing you already.
Yeah, and kind of allowing it to happen, you know, just sort of like, in some ways, sort of ushering it through and getting it in a bottle before it all goes bad. You know?
Well, I know that the 2014 releases have certainly caused quite a stir here in Melbourne. I remember, I think when I visited back in January, it was the next day you were going to be bottling the 2014 Chardonnay, so we could try it from tank, and it just blew my head off. But the one that's really got a lot of people's attention here in Melbourne is the 2014 Syrah, which for me, because we actually did try a couple of different vintages, is a bit of a departure. It's much lighter, you know, in terms of colour, and in terms of weight. It's a really different expression of Syrah from anywhere, really.
Yeah, it's I don't really look. We've always made the wines the same way, from the same vineyard. It's always been exactly the same paddock of grapes that we've used, and it's always been the same winemaking technique. I guess in 14, I don't really know, something went right. Like you do change things, or you do get better at your craft as it goes along. It's subtle. So it's subtle. The changes you make are subtle, and you don't even know you're doing it really. In some ways, you just get a little bit craftier at your craft. I'm not sure. And Sally is sort of got a really good affinity with vineyards, and she decided to pick she picked very quickly upon seeing the vineyard. There was never any hesitation about maybe it should be a few more days, and I guess we don't work with adding acid. We don't add acid, and we'd probably gotten better at not adding acid. So by simply managing that, and one of those things was to don't hesitate at the picking. Like, if you think it's right, things move really fast in those final few days. So if you think it's right to go, like, pick it now. Like, if you pick it in the next 6 hours, if you can, off they come. And I think in the condition of the grapes was really good in 14. We just kind of nailed it, and it just held together in the fermenter as a whole bunch. That whole bunch thing held together, and no juice came out. It was, in some respects, almost when we took the cover off it after a week, it was almost like we'd forgotten to make wine.
Just made itself.
Well, yeah, it still looked like the grapes we put in there. It was amazing. It was amazing. It was quite beautiful. And then what we do is very simple. And I don't really have a firm explanation. There was not like a big departure in technique. It was maybe a departure in style in some respects. It did capture people's imagination.
Well, certainly, in terms of, I guess the other thing is media. I'm not sure that's the right word, but people like obviously our friend Daniel Honan, the wine idealist. He's responded to the wines quite profoundly, and I think he talked about Alice firing when she was here for Rootstock up in Sydney last year, trying the Syrah in the tasting and being quite astonished that this is not Australian Shiraz. And having, I can understand that, having read both of her books, sort of why she would be so, shocked at this expression of Shiraz, and maybe it's because she has that love of Beaujolais as well, or what she considers true Beaujolais. But at the moment, you're still just selling all the wines yourself, and are you exporting much?
We've done little bits and pieces over the years. We've sent wine to the UK. We initially, when we first got cracking in 2010. A lot of the wine we sent to UK, and more recently, so 10 and 11, we sold into UK. Not all of it, but certainly a larger amount of it. Yeah. Than we have more recently. We sent little bits of Northern Europe and a bit to Hong Kong. We've done little bits of export, but no, we sell the wine ourselves. Most Melbourne and Sydney, all over Australia, really. Just do into restaurants mostly. And a few retailers, and tend to just...
wines are available in small volumes.
Yeah.
But now that you've left Sticks, I'm assuming that you can focus all of your energies into Bobar, and certainly that answers. I've got a couple of Twitter questions here. David Bicknell, I'm sure people would know who that is, asked why you left Sticks. Obviously, I think you've answered that. But he also asked, any more plans to play Michael Hutchence in future television or film? I guess you probably need to look at a picture of Tom to get that question.
I think it caught his imagination one night when he was watching a telly movie on In Excess.
That was like last year or the year before.
Yeah, he sent me a message. He was like, what are you doing?
When I saw that tweet, I was like, I didn't know Tom was an actor. I thought he was being serious. And then Bob Coleman, a.k.a. Mountain Stirrer, asked, still making great bread.
Sometimes it's all right. Sometimes it's awful. I bash around with bread, but I don't make it as often as I ought to, as I'd like to. But I think Bob remembers them. I did cook some bread when he came over for lunch, and he must remember it fondly.
But thank you very much, obviously, for joining me today. It's been fantastic. What's the best way for people to follow Bobar and you and Sally?
We run a fairly lightweight kind of a what do you call it? Communications structure. So there's no website, but you can find us on all the social medias, and give us a buzz. The phone number's on the back label. Yeah, we always have to.
Well, first you have to find a bottle.
Yeah,
like this bottle. Like this bottle you've brought. Oh, and it's coincidentally, that's 2014 Yarra Valley Chardonnay that I enjoyed so much when I visited. But on Twitter, it's Bobar Wine.
Bobar Wine, yep.
And Facebook, it's Bobar Syrah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you'll find them there, but definitely just get in touch. You know, I'm sure you can track them down, and if you can track the wines down, they are definitely well worth a look. But again, thank you very much, Tom, for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks as always, guys, for listening to another episode of the Vincast. I have been James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and you can follow me on social media on Twitter and Instagram. I'm at Intrepid Wino, and the podcast can be followed on Twitter at the Vincast. You can find me on Facebook, facebook.com/Intrepid Wino. You can also find me on YouTube on the Intrepid Wino channel. But you can find lots of stuff on my website, intrepidwino.com, including all the episodes of the podcast and lots of different writings that I've done in the past. I'd love for you to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Player FM, however you want to. Share the podcast, like it when you see a tweet, that kind of thing. And if you can, leave me a review and a rating on iTunes and Stitcher. That would be fantastic. The question for this week, the wino asks, is what's your favourite grape variety in Australia? I hope you enjoyed this episode and let Tom and I know if you did. But until next time, bye.